book called Bloodred Dragonflies, and it's about to be launched in Cape Town next Tuesday. Jim has been in South Africa for 25 years. He's come from Philippines, and he writes in Filipino and in English, and his books have been published in the Philippines. He's quite sort of famous in the Philippines. Published about 10 books, but he's not really known. He's won some prizes in South Africa, but he's not really known in South Africa as a poet. So I hope this book is going to bring him into being a South African poet. But a lot of the poems are about Philippines as well. And in order to give some context, I asked Jim to write a sort of historical essay for the book for readers who don't know anything about the Philippines, which I'm going to ask him to read as well. It's not that long, but it's in the book as well. So I won't say anything about the poetry. That's what for us to just listen to and hear. Yeah, it's good poetry anyway. You'll see how it works.
I'm gonna read something first before I start reading the poems. First of all, I'd like to thank all of you who are here for joining us. And as Robert said, it's my first book in South Africa. Each of my books, I call them paper children. So this is my first paper child in South Africa. It's had a long and wonderful journey. I'd like to thank Robert, who was very patient throughout for actually the many years we've been discussing this book. Anyway, while we were trying to put this together, I was showing him various manuscripts with Robert for many years. So thank you, Robert, for opening the doors for this book and for my work. Okay, I'm gonna read the first poem. Actually, I sent the file, it said 20 poems, but then Robert said maybe I should read 2 poems in Filipino that were translated into English. So I added one more, so now it's 21 poems. I hope that's not too much. So the first poem is called Salagubang, and I'm gonna read it to sort of disorient you guys a little bit because it's gonna be in Filipino. Salagubang is the word for the common beetle. And there are many types of beetles in the Philippines. They have different colors, green, gold, they have different names. The gold ones are called salaginto. The common one is salagubang, which is what this poem mentions. The odd thing about this poem, the original Filipino had extra stanzas, and I can't remember now whether Robert said take those out or whether I forgot to translate them for him. So the English version is slightly different from the Filipino. So I'm gonna read the Filipino version first. The title is actually Galing Inglaterra, which means from England. But the title in English is Salagubang. So here's the Filipino. Galing Inglaterra. Nagbabasa ako ng aklat galing Inglaterra, nang tila may lumagutok sa bintana. Salagubang. Bahagyang nakalantad ang kulay tsokolating pakpak. Nangungunyapit sa pari-pari sukat na screen. Paglapit ko, marahin niyang ikinubli ang mga pakpak, parang lihim. Kumibot-kibot ang kanyang katawan, hingal marahil matapos ang malayong paglalakbay. Himala ng baha-bahagdang karupukan ng laman. Ilang parisukat ang kanyang inakyat, bago huminto at tila tumitig sa akin at sa hawak kong aklat galing Inglaterra. Sandaling pagkatagal-tagal, pakiramdam ko'y lumulutang ang sahig, ang bintana, ang buong silid sa loob ng kanyang sinaunang titig. Pagkibot niya'y nanlamig ang aking kamay. Humakbang ako palabas ng silid at dagling pinatay ang ilaw at ipininid ang kulay lupang pinto. Naupo ako sa ibang panig ng bahay, sa sala yata o sa kusina, pilit nagbasa muli habang alam kong walang tinag siyang nag-aabang sa aking pagbalik. All right, so the English version now. Sa lagubang. I was reading a book from England when something rattled on the window. Sa lagubang. Its chocolate-colored wings partly showing. It clung to the tiny squares of the screen. The moment I came close, it slowly hid its wings like a secret. Its body quivered as if panting after a long journey. Miracle of terraced fragility. It climbed up a few squares before it ceased and seemed to stare at me and the book in my hand. The floor, the window, the whole room, everything was floating in this ancient stare. Well, the next few ones, I don't think they need a lot of explanation. The one is called The Way a Heart Ricochets. I thought this and the following poems might bring you back a little to something familiar like love and loss. So, The Way a Heart Ricochets. The call of a guinea fowl in the late hours. A wheel on an axle that needs oiling. Spun by the wind or a hand that remains unseen. Things you never touched now seem near and distant at the same time. The next one is called The Path of the Wind for my wife, Margie. The Path of the Wind. I have seen days when the wind weighs so heavy on trees, they bend close to breaking. A limb with the greenest leaves or weakened by age would have to give in. The trunk may have to learn a new angle, sunward. Less apparent is the path the wind must make. It has to unravel, splitting itself into countless strands to navigate between each leaf, each branch. The next one is called The Sound Before Water. It's actually the title poem for one of my books that was published in the Philippines. It was in 2013. The Sound Before Water. The sound just before water reaches the end of a tap when you are about to wash your hands is not much different from that deep breath you take in before diving. But you don't hear it because it is not your breath. And no one thinks of diving at that moment when hands need washing. Unless your mind takes you to a bridge in fog, or a boat without oars, or a miscounted step on the stairs you thought you knew with your eyes closed. Not everyone has a tap. Not everyone disappears forever into fog or is embraced by deep waters, falling when they expected someone's arms. Okay, the next one is like a goodbye thing. It's called Lines Too Late to Utter. Lines too late to utter. Look for me on the edges of shadows at dusk, away from street lights and neons, beyond the urban sprawl where people are boxed meals. Listen to my whisper between a dog's fading howl and the snapping of a cat's claw as it runs up a wall with graffiti skin. Forget what I wrote you years ago. Those promises have found their boundaries. Go, take flight, my love. The next one is, if anyone wants to say anything, I think it's all right.
Yeah, if anyone wants to say anything, please say. But if not, it's fine.
If not, okay, all right.
Wait, I
Okay,
think
can I
Dimakatsa
just
was
say
going to.
something? Because I think these first three poems that you've just read, they are stylistically very different from the other 17 that you're gonna be reading. Also in terms of mood and tone, I think they differ because they have this almost meditative feel about them. There's almost a detachment by the speaker. And so I just thought maybe I had to also say that you will find that they have a strength of drawing us into a particular object of nature, drawing attention to its essence. So they have got that clear water quality about them. Something that I found that is different from the other 17 that you're gonna be reading. And so they almost suspend a sense of time, you know, the usual fast pace of time, they sort of suspend it so that you focus on this, on the exquisite, the exquisiteness of this particular object of nature, giving them a really surreal kind of experience. Yeah, that's how I felt them. And I think the lack of punctuation also helps to create that light, breezy, almost meditative mood. And then you will see that with the subsequent ones, there's a lot of punctuation and they differ from the first three. Okay, thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, I'm gonna go on. The next one is called How the Pineapple Came to Be. This is based on a folk tale often told to little children in the Philippines. It is maybe a preparation for loss, but it seemed nothing to us then as little kids, but a warning about laziness and listening to your parents. So here's how the pineapple came to be. The mother sought to share the burden of chores. The child preferred to twist and stretch time in her little mind. The mother kept asking her daughter to find a broom, a pot, a ladle, or something else dictated by domestic life. Her voice grew dry as overcooked rice. I cannot find it, mother, was Pina's repeated reply while snapping spider webs. Use your eyes, my child, or you may have 1,000. Those were the last words she heard from her mother. The curse, unleashed in half a breath, struck Pina's dreaming head. Then there was silence, heavy as nightfall on an empty bed. A mother's grief, a village search until dawn. With countless eyes, wide and unseeing, Pina stared forever at her mother, doubled over at the bottom of the wooden steps. Okay, the next one is called After the First Monsoon Rain. This is actually the first poem in the book. The monsoon rains are called Habagat, the southwest monsoon, and Amihan, northeast monsoon. They used to bring bounty and joy to children in the Philippines, but these days the rains are something to dread because of climate change. They bring deluge and destruction like never before. By the way, one of my twin daughters is called Amihan, So yeah, here's the poem. After the monsoon rain. Doors along narrow line of houses empty out with children. Banana leaves bend to drop the last beads of rain down their palms. He is among them, this boy, with the breath of summer. The scent of earth roused by rain fills his lungs. He runs and zigzags to his friends, making sure to hit every puddle with every leap. The louder the splash, the better. Okay. The next one is called Decades After the War. The public primary school I attended had a series of massive rocks embedded in the open area where the students gathered for school assemblies. Some rocks were remains of the walls of a military outpost for Japanese soldiers during World War II. Whether this was true or not mattered little to young minds. So here's the poem. Decades after the war. You rub your eyes as if in waking, yet they linger. Threads embedded in your iris, outlines of shadows, transparent shapes in a huddle round the lone water tap. Dusk settles on the roofs of the school buildings. You are 9, and it's time to go home. The other kids don't see what makes you tremble, what makes you feel like you have to pee. They carry their bags on their shoulders and walk right through those shapes, as in mist. Their laughter fades, and you are still there, holding the bottle a teacher asked you to fill. The uneven ground on the field begins to rise. The wall of an abandoned fort appears, calling to the thirsty soldiers. The next one is called The Crabs. Originally, this poem was much longer. It actually had 2 sections, and then Robert suggested just having the one section. So this is it. It's called The Crabs. I was a skinny child, squeamish about cracking open the crab my mother cooked. She flinched, lifting the clumps strung together from the market, their pincers bound with bamboo strips. Their protruding eyes swiveled about, probing their changed world, their mouths tiny flapping windows before a brewing typhoon. Then a frantic banging on the sides of the pot until the bubbling drowned them out. The next one is called Bladed Spurs. It's about cockfighting. Cockfighting was, well, not part cockfighting, but partly. Cockfighting was introduced by the Spanish. They were in the Philippines for over 300 years. So it's one of the nice things they taught us. Roosters were introduced from colonies in other parts of the world. It is a ruthless pastime, usually reserved for men. This is called Bladed Spurs. Bladed Spurs. They lived in bamboo cages under the house. They heard our footsteps on the wooden floor, felt the dust coming down like rain between the slats. They must have regularly heard my mother screaming in a bad dream, my sisters fighting over a hairbrush or a shirt, my father cursing at a missed hoop shot on TV. But they never heard me. When I came down to feed them scoops of mixed grain in water with my bare hands, their eyes were shifty, as alert as when they're about to be thrown in the middle of a sandy ring, the shouts of jostling men in tiers of wood and concrete around them, closing in with bets and spits, where death awaited in beaks and bladed spurs. My father would sometimes tell me to hold one of them as he trimmed down its comb. It covers an eye when it flops down too long, he explained. A handicap in a fight. The rooster's heart beat against my hands. The heat of skin beneath its feathers burned with a metallic shine. The next one is called Citizens Military Training. The Philippines was under martial law for many years, and young students in high school and university were forced to do citizens military training. I was one of them. So here's the poem. Citizens military training. Hand-me-down boots, deep jungle green, a size too big, reeking of memories of someone else's feet. Another Saturday morning wasted pretending to stand at attention while being spat on by kitchen ranked officers. Suddenly felt something squirm under my left foot, something under the thick black sock I had doubled over to make the boot fit. This thing resisted the weight of my toes, pierced through my sock as if with needles, made me jump out of line and curse. Punishment. 4 hours in full sun. At long last, the stroke of noon, the relief of loosening laces, shaking free the boot. Just then tumbled out, exoskeleton popped open, a muffled hissing, a sizzle, a twitch which grew still. My tormentor, an American cockroach. Okay, the next one is called The Calendar, but I'm going to read the Filipino original, which is also quite different from the English. It's a little longer, the Filipino one, original. So I'm gonna read that first. It's the title is also different. It was originally called Sa Mga Iminulat, which literally means to those who were brought up. Okay, so here's the Filipino. Sa mga iminulat, bakas pa sa dingding ang kalendaryo na may larawan ng diktador at ng kanyang mag-anak bago lisanin ang palasyo. 5 taon ding nakapako ang kanilang mararangyang ngiti sa aming bahay, nakikibagay sa mga florerang mumurahin at walang bulaklak, sa mga bansot na tropeo, sa mga aklat na nakakulong sa salaming may kandado. Ang dating kinis ng karton sa dingding, ang umani ng dumi ng butiki at alikabok ng panahon. Ngayong pinilas na nila ang gunita ng pagkamangha kay Apo, may naiwang bakas na parihaba, tila puting anino o kaya'y multo na nakapako sa alaala naming mga anak na iminulat sa iba't ibang paraan ng paglimot sa kasaysayan. The calendar. The state-issued calendar, smooth and shiny at first, grew a skin from my mother's cooking, gathered daily dust and droppings from geckos. For years, my sister and I got used to eating while being watched by the cardboard eyes of the dictator and his family, their opulent smiles mocking the flowerless chalk vases, the 6-inch high bowling trophies, the scant collection of books locked behind sliding panels of glass. Long after the regime was toppled, my parents still kept the calendar. They cut off the year in the months, leaving the picture uneven and jagged. One day, on coming back from school, my eyes lingered at a rectangle on the dining room wall. I saw a lighter tinge of the same paint and holes where the nails had been. Okay, that's the first time since we were working on this book that I actually saw a huge difference between the original and the English. It's like a very different poem altogether. there's just chunks that are not there in the English.
Wow.
And also in the English, there's parts that aren't in the Filipino. So it's a total, like,
So
it's a weird rebirth.
how do you mean, Jay? Like,
Um,
you
like
can find
at least
words?
4 or 5 stanzas are totally different
Okay.
in detail and but then the poems are saying the same more or less, but it's just they're like totally different poems. Sorry, I just noticed it now. Okay.
Is that good or bad or what?
Yeah.
They're just very, very different.
Okay.
Yeah, only if you can read both will you pick it up. It's just the details are still there mostly, but they just seem like totally different poems. It's like a transformed piece of work. That's all I can say. It's like anyway,
Okay.
it's just a weird feeling to see that just now.
Sure.
Okay. The next poem is called Seeing in the Dark. It's like a twin poem to the one after it, which is You Had to Leave. In January 1994, I was working at a non-governmental organization in the Philippines called Center for Social Policy, while I was also teaching part-time at the university where I earned my bachelor's degree in English literature. I remember telling my students that I will never leave the country. The secretary at the NGO where I was working was said to be a palm reader, but she was very religious and didn't like using her gift. Anyway, I sort of forced her to. It's called Seeing in the Dark. Seeing in the Dark. It was a gift she never wanted to use unless you begged her for some glimmer of a future. She said faith should be enough. But seeing the doubt in my eyes, she had to allow geometry to lead me out of the dark. You will leave your country, stare loneliness in the eye, bury the dead among the living, and resurrect them unwillingly, because your hands are your way of seeing in the dark. I laughed, a bitter laughter I had never heard before. The next poem is called You Had to Leave. You had to leave. Nightmares no longer scare you like they used to. Not the fat creature that sits on your chest before dawn. A pair of new moons for eyes and a face of darkness. Not the red hand that touches your heel, grabs your calf, drags you under the bed, your mouth open and soundless. Not the voice of an old man mumbling next to your pillow. Then behind the door, then down the stairs, saying half words like air before downpour. What you took with you feels like an open wound the dogs can smell.
Good grief.
Sorry, someone saying feedback?
I just said
No?
good grief.
Oh,
Sure.
thank
Wow.
you. Okay, we're gonna move now to a slightly darker area. This one's called Face in the Tar. The notes in the book say the gruesome details in the poem are no exaggeration. In the beginning of the poem, it's going to mention the son of the dictator. He's actually running for president in the Philippines right now. And according to the surveys, he's still ahead, but the one trying to beat him, who is the current vice president, she's gaining momentum apparently. She's very good and I hope she wins. Face in the Tar. The dictator's son always got more than he wished. One birthday it was a yacht, and a man dressed as a baby, leaping out of a giant cake. One of the dictator's daughters had a wedding entourage that rivaled Princess Diana's. The cathedral would be nothing but rubble afterwards. The other daughter could have the face of the moon if she wanted. The flick of her chin could turn a teenager into a mangled mess. The dictator's wife generously grew 1,000 feet just to please the shoes she was compelled to purchase, to stamp out sadness from her carved out heart. The dictator himself could make people disappear from their homes and be found floating down a river, their heads athrob with crabs. If you questioned any of them, your face would be melted into tar to patch up the highway that bore his name. Actually, that highway was built right over our house. And yeah, so our original house is no longer there. The next poem is called Escape. It's about my nephew, Jerome, who was a very cute boy when he was small. He looked exactly like the young Dalai Lama in the Martin Scorsese film Kundun. I don't know if you guys have seen it. Sadly, cuteness and innocence are often temporary. So this is Escape. Escape. The day I visited my nephew at rehab, there were people screaming. One of the patients had bolted when he saw the gate open. My sister told me to stay in the vehicle until it was safe. They caught the guy, beat him up a bit. Solitary was definite. My sister unwrapped the food she packed for all to share, as if nothing was more ordinary. The trees gave some shade that humid afternoon. My nephew said he'd like to come home again. All of us knew it wasn't time, but spoke of days before everything went dark. Strips of garbage bags fluttered on the barbed wire. The next poem is called Archipelago. Archipelago. From very young, it was drummed in our heads that my country was an archipelago. Think of a man about to lift a sack of rice, one teacher said. In high school, I saw the shape of Marcos, the dictator, and his loot. Hunched, he boards a US Air Force helicopter that bends the trees around the palace grounds before the mob at the gates break through. These days, it takes the shape of the new tyrant, his throat a howling wilderness. He coughs out curses, splattering them onto something leaning on his leg. One more victim bundled up with packaging tape. One day, I will visit my homeland again, as if from outer space. Behold, a string of emeralds on a tilted silver tray.
Beautiful image.
Thank you. The next poem is called "We Will Not Allow the Dead to Be Silenced." This poem, I actually was surprised when Robert decided to include it in the book. It's not my most subtle work. In a way, it should have been written and included in one of my previous books. It was called "How to Make a Salagubang Helicopter and Other Poems," which was against the current president, Rodrigo Duterte, who is a murderer and who ordered the murder of thousands of people. Many of them just disappeared. Between 7,000 to 37,000 is the estimated number of people who have died under his regime. And he's leaving the post. Luckily, there is no re-election for presidents in the Philippines, so he can't. His daughter is running for vice president, and the former dictator's son, Marcos Jr., is running for president. So hopefully they all lose. Yeah, so we will not allow the dead to be silenced. We will not allow the dead to be silenced. The man who curses shall be cursed to live forever in the stories we shall tell our children. They will not fear him or his twisted reincarnations. Our children shall not be shaken by his threats. His attack dogs with teeth of bullets will not make us turn away and flee. Though the dead may be left unclaimed in morgues or dumped on the side of the road, their faces bound with packaging tape, they will never be silenced. The veins on their exposed necks and stiffened arms will turn to roots, and we who fight to remember the cruelty inflicted upon those we can no longer hold shall bear bitter fruit to be shoved down the tyrant's throat. Okay, the next one is called Dragonflies. I mentioned our old house. It's in here now. Dragonflies. It isn't possible to find the old house where you taught me how to take my very first steps, Mother. The government didn't just tear down its foundations, they buried it under 20 feet of soil. Over that, they stretched tar in the name of the dictator, built a bridge that tore the shoulders of the river. Then they carved out the hill that was almost a mountain. We shook our heads at your tombstone, stretched to the horizon, the last of the fields where running children would freeze in their tracks at the sight of blood-red dragonflies. The last poem, sorry, is any feedback? No?
Well, read the last poem and I'll give you feedback.
All right. The last poem, I'm reading it just to soothe you guys a little bit because the others are a bit horrifying. This was inspired by the documentary Life in Cold Blood by David Attenborough. It's called Chameleon Birth. Chameleon Birth. Veins pulsing, she grips the branch that holds her up. Tongue bunched inside her jaws, soundless. Her slit of flesh finally blossoms. A ball of slime drops, but refuses to plunge to rough ground. Membrane clings to closest branch. In a breath, a limb breaks that soft sheet. And this thing, a minuscule version of its mother, starts to climb. Born with the same slumbering acrobatic agility, it creeps upward, seeks warmth for its fragile skin, while she gives birth to another and another, until all life nearly drained, she heads down. Slow body gently presses against each offspring, a first and last caress. I think that's it.
All right. Anybody like to give some comments? Please do. It's the first time
Yeah.
Jim's read from his book. What do you want to say?
Well, just very, very moving, Jim.
Yeah.
Very
Hi, Mindy.
moving. Hello.
Nice to see you.
Oh, it's nice to hear you read the work because I've read them on paper, but it's different when you actually read it.
Bit
Sure.
nervous. Sorry, I'm making mistakes everywhere.
Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because you come through. That's the thing. Your essence
Yeah.
comes right through.
Thank you.
Hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. Jim, thank you so much. I'm sorry I came late because I was teaching, but wow, your presence in those poems when you share them through reading, I was very, very, very moved. Very
Thank you.
deeply moved. Yeah, thank you. Wow.
I actually started recording, making audio recordings, and I've posted one online and made a short, like, sort of video. I didn't show my face. I don't like showing my face. Anyway, it's the Path of the Wind. I made a short video, and it's on YouTube now. I don't know if anyone's watching it at all. Anyway, if people like it, I'm going to make others.
Sure, you should.
Thank you. Okay.
There's a baboon on the roof. He's gonna go chase it away.
Just
Mindy.
chasing the baboons off the roof. So quite normal. So yeah, I think I like the range, you know. I mean, there's a tremendous softness and delicacy, and there's a kind of, in the face of all this absolute, you know, especially the harshness of dictatorship and violence and the war, and you know, it's you manage to kind of preserve the delicacy of life with lots of care and observation, and also your images are extremely graphic, you know, like photographs. So it's you're entering into a whole sort of landscape when you read a poem. You're entering into a kind of environment that you've created. It's kind of mature poetry. It's like poetry we all want to write.
Sure.
Thank you.
So I've asked Jim if he'd just read the essay at the end of the book, which is on a separate PDF that you've got there, just because I find it very interesting, but also it'll be just interesting to see how people respond to it. It's a lot about the Philippines, of course, but it's also written, you know, it's written by a poet, not by a historian. So.
Okay. It's called Various Histories.
The Philippines is an archipelago
Of over 7,000 islands, so taking to the water has been a necessity and a skill among its inhabitants. Its geographic location made it a natural trading post in the Pacific, long before the first Europeans arrived in their galleons. It also sits on major earthquake fault lines and is part of the chain of active volcanoes around Asia known as the Ring of Fire. Typhoons regularly visit the country, often leaving huge devastation. My country of birth has had a long list of invaders through the centuries. The colonial empire of Spain ruled with cross and sword for over 300 years. The United States of America and its roughly 50 years of domination introduced the public education system along with torture and genocide. Japan staked its bayonets for 3 years during World War II. In the late 1890s, Philippine revolutionaries were fighting to put an end to Spanish rule. The Spanish knew they no longer had the power to keep the country, but they could not admit defeat to people they deemed to be unworthy opponents. America was waiting at the doorstep, laying the foundations for its young empire. It earned the trust of revolutionary leaders by promising to support their new government. A mock battle was staged in Manila Bay in May 1898 between the two colonial powers, with Spain surrendering to the Americans. But within months, this became reality when the Treaty of Paris was signed, declaring Spain's defeat and the agreement to sell the Philippines for 20 million US dollars to the USA. It was in those turbulent years that Filipino crew members on trade ships passing the coast of Cape Town decided to abandon their posts and stay ashore. They established the first fishing community in Cork Bay. When I first got here, I thought I would be the first Filipino to set foot in South Africa. Much later, I learned how inaccurate that was. I arrived in South Africa in October 1994, knowing only one person. I had met her on my first trip to the mountain province in the Philippines in 1993. She was on holiday from teaching English in Japan. She did not have the luckiest time in Manila, losing her traveler's checks soon after arriving. Someone suggested she go up north. We were both trying to catch a bus from Banawe, home of famous rice terraces, that would take us to Bontoc and Sagada. The bus was already full of locals, so we ended up riding on the roof for the hours-long drive on narrow roads right next to cliffs. Being the monsoon season, the roads were slippery with mud, and we were told a number of times to jump off the side away from the sheer drop below if the vehicle began to tilt. The shared adventure brought us together. She came back to live with me in Manila the following year. Then I followed her to South Africa. I didn't know back then that Cape Town would become my home. Each time a stranger approached me, often not in a friendly way, they assumed I was from somewhere else. My appearance somehow drew anti-Chinese remarks. To those who showed real interest rather than veiled animosity, I tried to explain where I came from by identifying nearby countries like Thailand and Malaysia. I lost both grandfathers when I was very young. I remember very little about them. My mother's father lived in a room upstairs that had wide windows made of capis, translucent flattish shells from a particular type of oyster, cut to fit small squares in a wooden grid. I remember light coming in even when he shut those windows. He had a violin in the corner of the room, but he never took it out of the case. He had been a young widower, taking care of 3 daughters and a son during the Japanese invasion in World War II. There are photographs of me as a toddler sitting in his lap, a rare smile for the camera. He barely spoke to us, but with a single shout, he would send the neighbors' kids running, dropping the guavas they tried to steal. My father would have gone to university on a scholarship for his soccer playing abilities, but he had to support the studies of his younger sister. Military service seemed a good option, so he joined the Philippine Air Force. When he got called to duty, he would disappear for days. We were never told to where, for what. He claimed he was related to the Marcoses, coming from the same province in the north, and that they shared a middle name. My mother was a public school teacher. She got up at 5 each morning to prepare food for the whole family before setting off on foot to the local primary school. Many years after she retired, her former students would visit our house with Christmas offerings, sometimes with their young families in tow. My parents were active members of a local community organization which called itself Land for the Landless. people who put up their own houses and looked after their own needs on land outside the reach of government services. It was a rural area in the outskirts of Manila with rice fields and small vegetable farms by the river. We lived in a house that had been expanded many times through the decades to accommodate our extended family. Rooms were added or split up with thin dividers, sometimes just with blankets. Cousins and their own growing families somehow managed to make space. The whole house was a patchwork, with new wood nailed against thick old trunks. In the late 1970s, the Marcoses wanted to build a highway, naming it after the dictator. Our house stood in the way, as did most of the houses in the community. One day, huge machinery arrived, dumping mountains of soil and gravel. My family was paid a measly sum and given a short deadline to move out. The top part of our house was lifted off its base by volunteers and loaded onto the back of a truck, which took it a few kilometers down to a new spot. At one point, it got stuck on a low-hanging power cable. One of the neighbors climbed to the roof to deal with it. He got electrocuted and was rushed to the hospital. Relatives took over our house in that new location, and my family moved to another part of town. Soon, gray concrete roads buried the remaining rice paddies in the area. In the regime of Ferdinand E. Marcos, the Philippines, once Southeast Asia's economic wonder, became the country with the worst foreign debt record in the region. When martial law was declared in 1972, I was a toddler. Curfews remained in force as I grew up. The hushed talk of the adults about protests, arrests, and disappearances went on for many years. My parents were Marcos loyalists, the quiet type who didn't join campaign rallies and believed every word from the government-controlled media. The Marcos family and their cronies took over major businesses and independent media entities. They buried the population in debt while putting on an extravagant show of wealth. The military crushed all dissent and resistance. In 1983, the assassination of Ninoy Aquino, the staunchest critic of the regime, galvanized the opposition. There were protest rallies in different parts of the country, even in the conservative business districts. Marcos declared there would be snap elections in early February 1986 to prove to the country that he remained popular. Cory Aquino, the widow of Ninoy, became the unlikely candidate for the opposition. My mother, like all public school teachers, was required to work at the polls. As she oversaw the manual counting of ballots, which went on through the night, she knew that the Marcos administration had lost. It made her cry in disbelief. In many parts of the country, there were reports of violence at the polls, of election officials resisting armed men who wanted to snatch ballot boxes. During the national counting of votes, it became clear the Marcos regime had tried to rig the elections. Cory Aquino called for nationwide civil disobedience. Former military supporters of Marcos declared a coup to oust him, and the Catholic Church sent out a call for people to protect him. Huge numbers responded, filling the major streets and highways of the capital. Fighter jets were sent to threaten them. Tanks rolled down the streets, but people blocked them with their own bodies. The few soldiers who still supported Marcos had running battles with the soldiers who had joined the coup. The military was ordered to fire at the protesters. They refused. Although under siege, the Marcoses declared victory and used state television to broadcast a flag-waving event, but within hours, they were airlifted from the presidential palace by US forces and brought to Hawaii. Soon afterwards, protesters broke through the gates. The groundswell of popular support swept Cory Aquino to the presidency in what would be called the 1986 People Power Revolution. School was called off just before the elections. I was a high school student then, awkward and out of place in the exclusive Ateneo de Manila, run by Jesuits, where I had been accepted on a financial scholarship. Some of my classmates had joined rallies. I never dared. But in February 1986, I took a jeepney as far as I could, then went on foot to join thousands of people ambling about on EDSA, the widest road in Manila, as if they were in a fiesta. I walked with them for hours, past buildings pitted with bullet holes, and corners where flowers and rosaries had been offered to soldiers. I couldn't tell my family where I'd been. My father finally came home after being holed up in the military base. He was incensed because he had to buy yellow ribbons, the color of the opposition, and tie them to his vehicle to be let through the crowds. He and my mother wept together. In the space of a few days, he had lost all his authority. During martial law, anyone could get picked up by a soldier or a lowly police officer for the slightest reason. Growing up with a father in the military gave my family a sense of protection. He was often called upon by relatives to help get someone out of trouble. Under the Marcos regime, all senior high school and first-year university students were required to undergo citizens military training. We were told we could be called to serve anytime to fight the growing insurgency. The new government that took over didn't remove this policy. I had no money to buy army boots. I got hand-me-downs, 2 sizes too big. I had to wear thick socks and fold them over. I broke my ankle once running with those oversized boots. We had drills every Saturday morning until noon. One time, we were ordered to be at a military base to learn to fire a rifle. That day, my best friend got kicked in the side by one of the soldiers for laughing when we were supposed to be aiming at targets. After the death in exile of the former dictator, the Marcos family were allowed to return to the country. They refused to return the funds they had stolen while they were in power. They never recognized nor apologized for the human rights abuses committed under the dictatorship. They regained their foothold in politics in both local and national elections. The outgoing president of the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte, elected in 2016, is facing possible arrest by the International Criminal Court for his so-called war on drugs, during which between 7,000 and 30,000 have been killed. Not just accused drug users, but also political and environmental activists, indigenous people, lawyers, mayors, church leaders, and journalists. Before he came to power, the country had seen an economic boom under the leadership of the son of Cory Aquino, Benigno Aquino Jr. All those gains were squandered by the rampant corruption that Duterte and his officials orchestrated. In early 2022, just when this book was being printed, the former dictator's son, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., was running for president. His main opponent is Leni Robredo, who, like Cory Aquino, is the widow of a prominent political leader. Robredo had previously beaten Marcos Jr. when they both ran for vice president of the country. She promises to end impunity and corruption.
Sure. Sure. Sure.
All right.
Sure. It's a very good essay.
Sorry, it's a bit long. for
No, it's
now.
not. It's hell of a interesting.
All right. So, I don't know who's coming to the Bathurst Book Fair Sunday, but we've got copies. Otherwise, Marika's got copies. Otherwise, I can send you a copy. But anyway, that will work that out, those who want to copy. But this is the book. It's the Bloodred Dragonflies are from that poem Dragonflies that Jim read. And his daughter designed a cover. So beautiful. Oh, someone else would have a different selection, but that was my selection. And we sort of worked it out together. And I just hope it brings you more into the country, Jim. Sort of.
I hope so. Thank you.
A very fine book to kind of introduce you in. So, if anyone would like to say anything further, otherwise we can say goodbye.
Oh, okay. I'd say I enjoyed listening to the poetry. And yes, the essay on the history. And I just think because I came running from work, I think I'm still gonna go back and immerse myself into the works because I think there's a lot for me to gain from it. And I just think more on even other writers, because I think there is one lady I came across when I was doing my MACW there from the Philippines, and I enjoyed her work. I just forget her name. So I think coming across Jim's work today and thinking back on her work, it will make me want to read more about the Philippines and their writers. So yeah, it was a nice session.
Thanks, Uko.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Jim. I really, really was very moved by your work. Thank you.
I enjoyed the poems, Jim. Thank you very much. And I also like the variation in the book, you know, from the personal to nature.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. We'll see you next week.
No,
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye,
Thank you.
everyone. Bye, everyone.
Bye, Caesar. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jorge. All right.